Have you ever felt lost? As if your decisions didn't matter in the grand scheme of things? Perhaps you faced times when all seemed lost and hope seemed distant. The story of Ruth is a powerful testimony to how a single choice, made with faith and loyalty, can change the course of history. Ruth was a young Moabite girl without any rights or position, who made the decision to follow her mother-in-law to an unknown land and serve a God who was not hers. What unfolded from this simple act of faithfulness is a narrative of redemption, hope, and transformation. Join us as we explore how Ruth, a seemingly insignificant woman, became the key to King David's legacy and, eventually, to the coming of the Messiah himself. Discover how your choices today can echo into eternity, changing not only your destiny, but also the destiny of those around you. Make sure you subscribe to this channel and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of the biblical productions on this channel. That said, let's get to the story of Ruth. At the beginning of this extraordinary story, we are transported to an ancient time, in a land called Moab, located to the east of the Jordan River. Here lives a young woman named Ruth, a Moabite, born and raised in a culture distinct from that of the Israelites. Ruth was married to Mahlon, the son of Elimelech and Naomi, an Israelite family that had fled to Moab in search of survival during a severe famine that had struck their homeland, Bethlehem in Judah. Life, however, was hard for Ruth and her new family. Tragically, Elimelech died, leaving Naomi as a widow. Shortly after, both of Naomi's sons, including Ruth's husband, also passed away, leaving the women desolate and without support in a society where male protection was essential for survival. Ruth, still young and now a widow, faced an uncertain future. She could have returned to her father's house in Moab, where she might restart her life, perhaps even remarry and build a new family. This would have been the easiest and safest path. But beside her was Naomi, her mother-in-law, now embittered by the loss of her husband and sons. Feeling abandoned and hopeless, Naomi decided that the best course of action would be to return to her homeland, Bethlehem, where she might find some support among her relatives. Before departing, Naomi, in an act of love and selflessness, released Ruth from any obligation, advising her to stay in Moab where she could be among her own people in a familiar land. This was the moment when Ruth's story took an unexpected turn. Instead of choosing the safety and comfort of her home, Ruth made a surprising and faith-filled decision. In one of the most powerful and touching declarations in the entire Bible, she turned to Naomi and said, "Do not urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God." With these words, Ruth not only sealed her commitment to Naomi but also embraced a new identity, a new faith in an uncertain future in a foreign land. Ruth was willing to leave everything behind, her family, her homeland, her culture, to follow her mother-in-law in an act of unparalleled loyalty and love. She chose to identify with the people of Israel and the God of Israel, even without knowing what the future held. This decision was more than a simple change of location. It was a life commitment, an expression of faith and courage that echoes through the ages. So Ruth and Naomi departed from Moab to Bethlehem, a journey that would mark the beginning of a new chapter not only in their lives but in the history of God's people. Ruth's choice, driven by love and faith, is a powerful reminder of how our decisions, even the most difficult ones, can lead us to paths of redemption and purpose, often beyond what we can imagine. This was the first stepping stone on the path that would lead Ruth to become a crucial part of the lineage of King David and eventually of Jesus Christ himself. The story of Ruth teaches us that sometimes the greatest acts of faith come from the most unexpected places, and that these choices have the power to change the course of history. When Ruth and Naomi arrived in Bethlehem, the town was in an uproar. The return of Naomi after so many years did not go unnoticed. The women of the city recognized her, but the joy of the reunion was quickly overshadowed by the state in which Naomi returned, widowed, childless, and accompanied by a young Moabite woman, a foreigner. Naomi, embittered by her loss, expressed her pain by telling them not to call her Naomi, which means pleasant, but Mara, which means bitter, for she felt that the Almighty had dealt harshly with her. Ruth, on the other hand, began to understand the challenges they would face. In Bethlehem, without husbands or sons to provide for them, Ruth and Naomi had no resources and were at the mercy of charity. To survive, they needed to find a way to obtain food, and this meant that Ruth would have to work for both of them. In a foreign land, where her Moabite origin could easily make her a target of prejudice, Ruth did not let herself be discouraged. She decided to do whatever was necessary to sustain herself and Naomi. At that time, the law of Israel allowed the poor, the orphans, and the widows to glean the leftovers of the harvest that the reapers left behind in the fields. It was a charitable practice that allowed the needy to find sustenance, but it was also hard and humiliating work, especially for someone like Ruth who was in a foreign land. Even so, Ruth asked Naomi for permission to go to the fields and gather the leftover grains. Her courage and humility became evident when she was willing to face the difficulties that this task would bring. On that very day, as she walked through the field, Ruth happened to enter the fields of a man named Boaz. Unbeknownst to her, she was now under the protective gaze of someone who would play a fundamental role in her life. Boaz was a relative of Elimelech, Naomi's deceased husband, and was known in the town as a man of great character and wealth. He was respected for his kindness and justice, and God, in his providence, guided Ruth's steps to that field. At the end of the day, Ruth returned home with a generous amount of barley, surprising Naomi. When Naomi learned that Ruth had worked in Boaz's fields, her heart was filled with hope. She recognized Boaz's name and saw in him a possible redemption for their lineage, a spark of light amid the shadows that surrounded them. Once again, God's hand was at work, guiding Ruth's steps, even when she was not fully aware of it. Ruth's decision to glean in Boaz's fields was a turning point in the story of these two women. Ruth's humility in submitting to such difficult work and Boaz's provision for her showed that, even in the darkest circumstances, there was hope and goodness in the world. And more importantly, it was the beginning of a series of events that would forever change their lives and place them at the center of God's redemptive plan for Israel. As Ruth continued to work in Boaz's fields, her dedication and humility did not go unnoticed. Every day she would go out to gather the leftover grains, enduring the heat of the sun and the dust of the field, all to ensure sustenance for herself and Naomi. Boaz, a man of great reputation in Bethlehem, was known not only for his wealth but also for his integrity and devotion to God. He closely observed the behavior of his workers and those who came seeking help in his fields, and Ruth quickly stood out for her diligence and the respectful manner in which she conducted herself. Intrigued, Boaz sought to learn more about this young foreigner who worked so tirelessly. Upon hearing Ruth's story, how she had left her homeland and everything she knew to accompany and care for her mother-in-law Naomi, even without any guarantee of a promising future, Boaz was deeply moved. He recognized in Ruth a rare virtue, an unwavering commitment, and a heart full of kindness and courage. It was evident to him that God's hand was upon this young woman, and Boaz decided that he would do whatever he could to help her. So in a gesture of generosity and protection, Boaz called Ruth and spoke to her directly. He told her to continue gathering grains in his fields, assuring her that she would be well treated and protected by his servants. Additionally, Boaz instructed his workers to leave more grains behind so that Ruth could collect more than usual, ensuring that she and Naomi would have more than enough to survive. Boaz did all of this not out of obligation, but out of sincere admiration and respect for Ruth's character. This encounter was not just a simple interaction between a woman in need and a wealthy, compassionate man. It was the beginning of something much greater, a divine plan that was unfolding. Boaz, being a close relative of Elimelech, had the right and responsibility according to the law of Israel to act as a goel or redeemer. A goel was someone who could redeem property or protect a family lineage that was in danger of extinction. Without Ruth knowing, she had found not just a temporary protector but someone who would soon play a crucial role in restoring her life and Naomi's life. Boaz's kindness was a manifestation of God's providential care for Ruth. Ruth's life, which seemed destined for suffering and poverty, was, in fact, being transformed by this divinely orchestrated encounter. The story shows us how God works through people and circumstances to bring redemption and hope, even when everything seems lost. Ruth, the young Moabite who had left everything behind, was about to see God's hand move in ways she could never have imagined, initiating a series of events that would not only change her life, but also impact the history of Israel and the lineage of the Messiah. As the days passed, Naomi began to notice something special in the way Boaz treated Ruth. She saw in Boaz not just a good and just man, but someone who could be God's instrument to change their destiny. Naomi knew that Boaz was a goal, a relative with the ability to redeem her family's inheritance. But this redemption required more than generosity. It required a commitment that would change the lives of everyone involved. With wisdom acquired over the years, Naomi decided it was time to act. She instructed Ruth to do something that, at first glance, might seem strange, even risky. Naomi asked Ruth to prepare herself carefully, to wash, anoint herself with perfume, and put on her best clothes. When night fell, Ruth was to go to the threshing floor where Boaz would be sleeping after a day's work, and lie down at his feet. This gesture was a sign of humility and submission, a silent request for Boaz to exercise his right as redeemer. Ruth, always obedient and trusting in Naomi's wisdom, did exactly as her mother-in-law had instructed. The darkness of the night enveloped the threshing floor, and the silence was broken only by the soft sound of the wind in the fields. Ruth approached Boaz cautiously, knowing this was a decisive moment. When she lay down at Boaz's feet, she was, in a way, placing her life and future in his hands. It was an act of faith, hope, and deep respect for the tradition she, a foreigner, had chosen to adopt. In the stillness of the night, Boaz woke up, perhaps by Ruth's light movement or simply because he sensed someone's presence. Surprised to see a woman at his feet, he asked, "Who are you?" In a soft voice, Ruth replied, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your cloak over your servant, for you are a redeemer." These words carried a request that went beyond a simple act of kindness. Ruth was asking Boaz to take on the responsibility of redeeming not only Naomi's family lands, but also of taking Ruth as his wife, preserving Elimelech's lineage. This moment was filled with extreme tension and expectation. Ruth, a young woman without rights or status, was approaching Boaz in a gesture that could easily be misunderstood. But Boaz, a man of deep integrity, understood exactly what was happening. He recognized the courage and purity of Ruth's request and was deeply moved by her boldness and loyalty. Boaz knew that Ruth could have sought a younger man, someone her own age, but she chose to seek his protection as a sign of her commitment to the law of Israel and to her mother-in-law Naomi. Boaz, once again showing his noble character, accepted Ruth's proposal. He assured her that he would do everything in his power to fulfill the role of redeemer. But there was one detail that needed to be resolved. There was another relative, closer to Elimelech, who had the first right to redeem the inheritance and potentially to marry Ruth. Boaz, being a just man, knew he needed to address this situation in the correct manner. He asked Ruth to remain there lying at his feet until dawn, to avoid anyone seeing her and drawing the wrong conclusions. At daybreak, Boaz sent her back home with a generous amount of barley, a sign of his kindness and care, and a promise that he would resolve the matter legally. This moment was crucial for the lives of Ruth and Naomi. They were on the brink of a radical change in their lives, but uncertainty still lingered. However, Boaz's commitment to act justly and fulfill his role as redeemer brought renewed hope. Once again, we see how God's hand was guiding every step Ruth took, weaving a plan of redemption that would not only secure her future, but also place her at the center of Israel's redemptive history. At the dawn of the next day, Boaz knew that the matter of redemption could not be delayed. He went to the city gate, a place where legal decisions and important matters were discussed and resolved. The city gate was like the courthouse of the time, where the leaders and elders of Bethlehem gathered to deliberate on issues that affected the community. Boaz, being a respected man, took the lead to ensure that the fate of Ruth and Naomi was handled justly and according to the laws of Israel. Boaz did not hesitate to seek out the nearest relative of Elimelech, the one who, according to tradition, had the first right to redeem the family's lands and possibly marry Ruth to preserve the lineage. Upon finding this relative, Boaz presented the situation before the elders and witnesses present, explaining the need to redeem Elimelech's property and care for the widows, Naomi and Ruth. Initially, the relative showed interest in exercising his right of redemption, as it would mean adding valuable lands to his own estate. However, Boaz, with skill and honesty, explained that the redemption of the lands came with an additional responsibility: to marry Ruth, the Moabite widow, to continue Elimelech's lineage. Upon hearing this, the relative reconsidered. He realized that marrying Ruth could complicate his own inheritance and jeopardize the division of his property among his descendants. Fearing these complications, he decided to renounce his right of redemption, relinquishing any claim he might have had on the lands and on marrying Ruth. With the way now clear, Boaz, in the presence of the elders and all who were there, formalized his commitment. He declared that he would purchase Elimelech's lands, redeeming the property in the name of the family, and that he would take Ruth as his wife. This act was not just a gesture of kindness, but a solemn fulfillment of the law and tradition of Israel. By doing so, Boaz ensured the future of Ruth and Naomi, rescuing them from poverty and insecurity, while also preserving Elimelech's lineage. The marriage of Boaz and Ruth was more than a simple union of two people. It symbolized something much greater: the union of grace and law, of mercy and justice. Ruth, the foreigner who had arrived in Bethlehem with nothing, now became an integral part of the Israelite community, not just as a citizen, but as the wife of a respected and God-fearing man. Boaz, in turn, demonstrated that true power does not reside in strength or wealth, but in the ability to act with justice and compassion. This marriage was the culmination of a divine plan, in which God used ordinary people, with their choices and actions, to accomplish something extraordinary. The union of Boaz and Ruth not only secured the future of two destitute women, but also established a legacy that would have eternal consequences. For through this marriage, God was preparing the way for something greater than anyone could have imagined. The son, who would come from this union, Obed, would be the grandfather of the great King David. And through David's lineage, the Messiah, Jesus Christ, would come into the world. This story, which began with Naomi's loss and bitterness, culminated in redemption and hope, showing that even in the darkest circumstances, God is at work to fulfill his purposes. The redemption of Ruth by Boaz is a reflection of the greater redemption that God offers to all humanity. A redemption that comes through sacrifice and grace and has the power to transform lives and change history forever. With the marriage of Ruth and Boaz, the story takes a turn that few could have predicted at the beginning. That young Moabite woman, who had left everything behind out of love and loyalty, now became part of the Israelite community, not just as Boaz's wife, but as a vital link in the lineage that God had chosen to fulfill his eternal plans. The story, which began with pain and loss, now turned into a narrative of hope and redemption. Ruth and Boaz were blessed with a son, whom they named Obed. This boy, born of a union marked by faith and obedience, represented the continuation of Elimelech's lineage, but also something much greater. Obed would grow up to be the father of Jesse, and Jesse, in turn, would be the father of David, the shepherd boy whom God would choose to be the king of Israel. David, the man after God's own heart, whose life and reign would be deeply intertwined with the history of salvation that would unfold over the centuries. The arrival of Obed brought renewed joy to Ruth and Naomi. For Naomi in particular, this birth represented the restoration of everything she had lost. When Obed was born, the women of Bethlehem said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age." This moment was not just a return of material blessings, but a profound confirmation that God was working in all things, even in the darkest hours of her life. The birth of Obed marked not only the future of a family, but the destiny of a nation and eventually the whole world. The lineage that began with Boaz's rescue of Ruth and Naomi would culminate in David, and later, through the generations, would lead to the birth of Jesus Christ. the Savior of the world, as I've repeated here several times, to fix it in your mind. This was God's redemptive plan in action, manifested in everyday events, in decisions of faith, and in the loyalty of ordinary people who trusted in His purpose. The story of Ruth is a powerful reminder of how the choices we make, even in difficult times, can have consequences beyond our understanding. Ruth, by choosing to follow Naomi and embrace the God of Israel, entered into a story greater than either of them could have imagined. Her name, which could have been forgotten on the margins of history, is now remembered with honor and respect throughout the biblical narrative. Ruth the foreigner became the great-grandmother of the great King David, and her faith and loyalty were the instruments through which God brought salvation to the world. This story shows us that God is not limited by circumstances, origins, or social status. He uses those who are faithful, even in small things, to accomplish His eternal purposes. Ruth's legacy continues to inspire generations to this day. Her story is proof that in the midst of pain and uncertainty, decisions of faith can transform destinies. It is a testimony to the faithfulness of God, who fulfills His promises in ways that are often beyond what we can see or understand. Ruth teaches us that when we trust in God, even our simplest steps can be part of a grand redemptive plan that not only changes our lives, but also the course of history. Write in the comments what the story of Ruth can help you today. What lessons do you take from it? Subscribe to the channel and don't forget to leave a like. There are Bible stories here every week. May God bless your life.